Monique had been feeling the first tight pangs of labor for hours, but now they were growing stronger, more frequent. She had been here before, not in this hospital, but in the same position, full of anticipation, fear, and excitement all at once. But today was different. Today, she was alone. Her partner, James, a busy, successful surgeon, was stuck at the hospital in a meeting. She hadn't wanted to bother him earlier, but now she regretted it. She was just a few months away from the end of her pregnancy, but it seemed that her baby had other plans. The air was thick with tension and expectation as Monique stepped into the emergency room. She tried to ignore the discomfort as she approached the reception desk. The nurse behind the counter barely looked up from her computer screen as Monique stood there, breathing in quick, sharp gasps. "I'm here to check in. I'm in labor," Monique said, trying to sound as calm as possible. The nurse gave her a quick glance and then focused back on her computer. "Okay, fill out this form, and we'll get you to the right room." There was no smile, no warmth in her voice. Monique's fingers trembled slightly as she filled out the paperwork. She tried not to focus on the coldness of the environment, the sterile smell of the hospital, or the way the nurse's attitude made her feel like just another nameless patient. This was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but the impersonal nature of the place made her feel like a burden. Once the form was completed, the nurse finally gave her another glance and then nodded. "Room 14, down the hall, to your left. Go ahead and have a seat. We'll send someone to check on you." Monique nodded silently, turning away as she followed the directions. Her steps felt heavier with each contraction. She hoped this wasn't going to be a long process. She wanted to be able to hold her baby soon, to welcome the little life inside her arms. But as she made her way down the stark, fluorescent-lit hallway, the dread of being alone in a place that didn't seem to care about her made her stomach churn. When she reached room 14, she opened the door, half expecting to be greeted by the sounds of bustling medical staff or a friendly nurse. Instead, she was met with an eerie silence. There was a hospital bed with white sheets, a chair in the corner, and a small table by the window. The room felt cold, like it wasn't designed to welcome new life, but rather to rush people through their pain and suffering. Monique stepped inside, sighing heavily as another contraction hit. She tried to breathe through it, focusing on the baby, on the life she was about to bring into the world. But the pain was intense, and no one had come yet to check on her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. She was finally able to sit on the bed, her breath coming in shallow, quick bursts. Her mind raced as she tried to distract herself. But the thought of James not being here made her anxious. Why wasn't he here yet? He should have been the first to get the call. Her anxiety was growing, and the feeling of being alone in this sterile, lifeless room only added to her stress. Just as she was about to push the call button, the door opened and a nurse walked in. She was tall, with a no-nonsense look in her eyes and a clipboard in her hand. "Hi, I'm Nurse Kelly. You're the one in labor," Kelly asked, without looking up from her clipboard. She was going through a checklist as if she was checking off groceries. Monique nodded, trying to stay calm, despite the pain building in her abdomen. "Yes, the contractions are getting stronger." Kelly didn't seem particularly concerned by the urgency in Monique's voice. "All right, let's get you hooked up to the monitors, and we'll take it from there." As Kelly hooked up the 4 and adjusted the monitor on Monique's belly, she barely acknowledged her presence. The nurse's fingers moved quickly and efficiently, but the indifference in her movements made Monique feel invisible. She tried to speak, but another contraction interrupted her, and Kelly didn't look up from her work. Monique gritted her teeth, trying to breathe through it. The pain was building, tightening around her stomach, and she felt herself starting to sweat. But Nurse Kelly didn't seem in a rush to help. She took her time, checking her watch, tapping on the clipboard as Monique struggled through the contractions. "Is everything okay?" Monique asked, barely able to speak through the pain. "Shouldn't someone be checking my progress?" Kelly glanced at her, but only briefly, as if Monique were being an inconvenience. "We'll get to that soon enough," Kelly replied coolly. "Just relax. You're fine. The doctor will be in shortly." Monique's heart sank as she lay there, unable to do anything but suffer in silence. It felt like hours had passed, though it was only a matter of minutes. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the room closing in on her, the lack of empathy wearing her down. Monique had no idea how much time had passed since Nurse Kelly had left. The pain kept coming in waves, and each contraction felt more intense than the last. Her fingers dug into the sides of the bed, her knuckles white with the strain. She had tried to focus on breathing, to remain calm for the baby, but it was becoming nearly impossible. She needed someone to help her, someone to reassure her, but it felt like everyone was too busy to care. She glanced at the door, willing someone to come in, but it remained closed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fumbled to grab it. It was a text from James, but she could barely read the words through the blur of her pain. She wanted to respond, to tell him she was in agony, that she needed him here, but her focus kept slipping away, swallowed up by the constant pressure building inside her. "Where is he?" Monique thought, biting her lip as another wave of pain hit her. "Why isn't anyone here?" Another nurse passed by the door, glancing in briefly but not stopping. Monique called out, her voice shaky. "Excuse me," she shouted, the words strained from the pain. "I need help, please." The nurse hesitated, her back to Monique for just a moment. She didn't turn around. Instead, she continued walking, like Monique wasn't even there. Her heart sank as she realized how invisible she truly felt in this place. It was as if her pain didn't matter, as if the fact that she was a woman of color in a hospital full of strangers didn't matter. Monique squeezed her eyes shut, trying to ignore the rising anger and frustration that threatened to overwhelm her. She tried to focus on the baby again, on the life she was about to bring into the world. The baby needed her to stay calm, but the reality of the situation gnawed at her. The sting of disrespect she felt cutting deeper with each passing minute. It wasn't until the door finally opened that Monique felt a glimmer of hope. But it wasn't the doctor. It was Nurse Kelly, stepping back inside with a look of impatience on her face. She had a chart in her hand and didn't even look up as she entered. "All right, let's check how you're doing," Kelly said, her voice cool and detached, still not looking Monique in the eye. Monique could feel her frustration boiling over. She was in labor in intense pain, and yet it felt like Kelly couldn't care less. The nurse's fingers were quick, almost rough, as she checked the monitor on Monique's belly. Monique clenched her jaw, trying to ignore the discomfort of the touch. "Can't you see that I'm struggling here?" Monique managed to say, her voice tight, "I need someone to help me, someone who cares." Kelly glanced at her, but her expression remained unchanged. "You're fine. Just breathe," she said dismissively, her focus shifting back to her chart. "The doctor will be in soon. Just relax." Monique's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. She had never felt so small, so insignificant in her life. She had come here for help, for comfort, but it seemed that all she was met with was indifference. Was it because of her race? Because of her background? Or was it just the cold, impersonal nature of the hospital itself? She wanted to scream, to demand better treatment, but the pain was all-consuming, and her body was too tired to fight. Instead, she closed her eyes and focused on breathing, counting the seconds between each contraction, trying to distract herself from the overwhelming sense of isolation. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before Monique heard footsteps outside the door. She felt a flicker of hope stir in her chest. This time, it was different. She heard a man's voice, calm but urgent as the door opened. Monique's heart raced as she looked up, expecting to see the doctor, but what she saw instead made her stomach flip. Standing in the doorway was Dr. James, her husband, her partner in life, looking every bit the part of the confident, respected surgeon that he was. His eyes widened when he saw her, and for a moment he froze. Monique's breath caught in her throat. "James," she whispered, a mixture of relief and disbelief flooding her chest. She wanted to reach out to him, but her body was too weak, too consumed by the pain to do anything but lie there. James quickly moved to her side, his gaze shifting between her face and the monitors. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by concern and focus. He didn't speak right away, but instead, he turned to Nurse Kelly, his tone sharp. Why hasn't she been properly monitored? Why wasn't she given the proper care? Kelly stammered, caught off guard. "Dr. James, we were waiting for the doctor to—" "No!" James cut her off, his voice firm. "She's my wife. She should have been given proper attention immediately. Get me another nurse in here now. I need everything checked, and I need it done right." Monique's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never seen him so serious, so commanding. She could feel the shift in the room, the subtle change in the energy. Suddenly, everyone was moving faster, with purpose. The indifference she had been met with for hours now seemed to evaporate. James looked back at Monique, his eyes softening. "I'm here, baby. I'm so sorry. I should have been here sooner." Monique nodded weakly, her hand reaching out to grasp his. For the first time since she arrived, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't alone anymore, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. She was going to make sure no one else would be treated the way she had been. The room was suddenly filled with activity. Nurses bustled in and out, adjusting monitors, taking readings, and moving with a newfound urgency that hadn't been there before. It was as if the atmosphere had shifted completely once James had entered. For Monique, it was a bittersweet feeling. She was glad to have her husband by her side, but she couldn't help but wonder why it had taken him to change things. James didn't leave her side. His hands were gentle as they gripped hers, offering comfort as the contractions came in waves. He whispered reassurances, his voice low and soothing, but Monique could feel the tension in his shoulders. He was worried. She could see it in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. "Everything's going to be okay, Monique," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. His voice was calm, but she could hear the edge of urgency beneath it. "You've got this. We've got this." But Monique knew that something had to be said, something had to be done. The feeling of being disregarded, of being ignored, still lingered in the air like a thick fog. She had been in this hospital for hours, suffering in silence. But now that James was here, everyone had suddenly woken up to her needs. The door to the room swung open again, and the chief surgeon, Dr. Thompson, walked in. He was an older man, well respected in the medical community. His presence immediately commanded attention. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the monitors, and then turned to James with a nod. "Dr. James." "Everything looks stable," Dr. Thompson said with a tight smile. "We're ready for the delivery." Monique, still gripping James's hand, looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. James's eyes narrowed, and he stood up straight, his voice suddenly taking on a more authoritative tone. "Dr. Thompson," James began, his voice measured but firm, "before we proceed, I need to know why my wife was not given proper care earlier. Why was she left alone, suffering in that bed?" Dr. Thompson looked slightly taken aback, his gaze flickering between James and Monique. "I'm not sure what you mean. The staff is always attentive. No," James interrupted, his voice cold. "I'm talking about the fact that she was ignored for hours. No one came in to check on her. She was in excruciating pain, and nobody cared. You let her suffer." The room grew still, and Monique could feel the shift in the energy. It was as if everyone was holding their breath. She wanted to speak up, to echo James's anger, but her energy was drained. All she could do was listen, hoping for a resolution. Dr. Thompson's face turned a shade redder as he looked from Monique to James. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, he cleared his throat and nodded, a faint trace of guilt in his expression. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "There was a delay in attention. I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened." Monique's breath hitched at his words. She had never expected an apology from any of them, certainly not from someone as high-ranking as Dr. Thompson. But even as he apologized, it didn't change the fact that she had been treated as though she didn't matter. "You should have been here from the beginning, not just when your husband showed up." Nurse Kelly's voice cut through the tension. She had returned to the room, now holding a tray of medical instruments. "If she had been treated properly earlier, we wouldn't be in this position now." James's gaze turned to Nurse Kelly, and Monique could feel the fire in his eyes. He didn't speak, but his silence was enough. It was clear that he was holding back his fury, carefully choosing his words. The tension in the room was palpable, but Monique could feel herself starting to relax, her shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like hours. James was there now, and he was taking control of the situation. "You're right," James said, his voice calm but unwavering. Monique should have been treated with dignity and respect from the moment she walked in. And if anyone here has a problem with that, now's the time to speak up. The staff in the room shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. No one dared challenge James. He was respected, not just as a doctor, but as someone who had spent years earning trust and recognition in the field. His presence in the room was enough to make even the most senior doctors rethink their actions. Monique watched as Dr. Thompson and Nurse Kelly exchanged a look, and though neither said anything, it was clear they were realizing that they had failed in their duty. The room felt a little quieter, a little more respectful. "Let's proceed," Dr. Thompson said after a long pause, his voice steadier. "We'll make sure everything goes smoothly now." Monique nodded, relieved that things were finally moving forward. But the pain still gripped her, each contraction reminding her of the struggle she had endured. She squeezed James's hand tighter, pulling strength from him. She was ready to meet their baby, to finally bring this journey to an end. As the staff began to prepare for the delivery, James turned to Monique, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry, baby," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "This shouldn't have happened. You shouldn't have had to go through this." Monique smiled weakly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm just glad you're here," she whispered. And as the room filled with the sound of medical instruments being readied, Monique knew that no matter the pain, she wasn't alone anymore. She had James by her side, and together, they would face whatever came next. The room was filled with the sound of Monique's breathing, deep and steady, as she pushed with all the strength she could muster. The contractions came in relentless waves, each one forcing her body to respond, to move in ways it had never moved before. Every inch of her felt as if it were being torn apart, but she kept her focus. James was right there beside her, his hand on hers, his voice never leaving her ear. "You're doing great, Monique. Just a little more. I'm right here." Monique nodded, trying to gather her strength. She could feel the sweat on her brow, the exhaustion setting in, but she refused to let go. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had dreamed about. The room was quiet except for the sound of her labored breathing and the occasional murmurs from the medical team as they monitored her progress. Nurse Kelly stood at the foot of the bed, observing closely, though Monique couldn't bring herself to look at her. She was still angry at the way she had been treated earlier, the way she had been neglected. But right now, she had a job to do, and it wasn't about them. It was about her and her baby. James squeezed her hand tighter, his face filled with determination. "You're almost there, baby. We're so close." Monique nodded, feeling the wave of another contraction build. She could feel the pressure in her lower back, the urge to push, to finally end the pain. She took a deep breath, focusing all of her energy on the task at hand. Her heart raced, but with each breath, she could hear James's voice, calm, steady, unwavering. It was a lifeline. With a deep, guttural sound, Monique pushed once again, feeling as though every fiber of her body was being stretched to its limit. The pain was intense, but she refused to give up. She knew that if she could just make it through this, she would hold her child in her arms. James leaned down, his face close to hers. "I love you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're incredible. I'm so proud of you." Monique's heart swelled with love. "We're doing this together," she whispered back. "We've always done it together." Dr. Thompson was watching closely now, his voice calm and professional as he guided Monique through the final stages. "Just one more push, Monique," he instructed. "You're doing great. I can see the head. Just one more push." Monique's body screamed with the effort, but she pushed with everything she had. She heard the collective intake of breath from the medical staff, and then, finally, there it was. The sound she had been waiting for, a baby's first cry. The relief that flooded her body was almost overwhelming. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. James's eyes filled with tears as he looked at their newborn child, the child they had brought into this world together. He was beaming, his face lit up with joy and pride. "It's a girl," James said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Monique's heart overflowed with love as she looked at their daughter, her tiny body wrapped in a soft, white blanket. James leaned in, his hands trembling as he carefully cradled the baby in his arms. He brought her close to Monique, placing the child in her arms. Monique's eyes welled up with tears as she gazed at her daughter, her beautiful, perfect daughter. She had fought through the pain, fought through the neglect, and now she held the most precious gift in her arms. "Welcome to the world, baby girl," Monique whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "You're everything I ever dreamed of." The room was still. The only sound the soft cooing of the newborn and the gentle hum of the medical equipment. It was a moment of peace, a moment of connection. Monique's heart swelled with pride and love for the tiny life in her arms, and she knew deep down that all the struggles, all the pain, had been worth it. James stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his face still filled with awe. "She's perfect, Monique," he said, his voice a mix of wonder and disbelief. "She's perfect." Monique smiled, her heart full. "She's our perfect little miracle." The nurses and doctors began to clean up, preparing to take the baby for a quick checkup. But Monique didn't want to let go of her. She didn't want to miss a single moment with her daughter. She looked up at James, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being here, for everything." James smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Thank you for being you," he replied. "You're amazing, Monique." As the nurses took the baby for her checkup, Monique felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had made it through. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty. It was all behind her now. She was a mother, and her world had just changed in the most beautiful way. And as she lay back in the bed, James by her side, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't just the birth of their daughter. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where they would face the world together, stronger than ever. The hospital room felt strangely calm now, a peaceful silence hanging in the air. Monique's heart was still racing, her body still aching from the intensity of labor, but a sense of tranquility had settled over her as she held her newborn daughter. The world outside seemed to fade away, and for the first time since entering that hospital, Monique felt truly at peace. James was standing near the window, his eyes fixed on their daughter in the bassinet, a smile playing on his lips. Monique couldn't take her eyes off of him. He had been her rock throughout this whole ordeal. He had been there for her when no one else seemed to care. He had supported her in ways that she hadn't expected, and it made her love him even more. But as the minutes passed, the memory of the hours of neglect and mistreatment came rushing back. Nurse Kelly's face flashed in her mind. The way she had ignored Monique's cries for help, the way she had brushed off her pain. Monique had tried to shake off the anger, telling herself that it didn't matter now. But it did. It mattered. James turned back toward her, his face softening as he saw the lingering tension in her eyes. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, a quiet concern in his tone. Monique nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." James walked over to her, taking her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "You've been through a lot," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been through a lot, but we're okay now." Monique smiled faintly, grateful for his words. "We are." As the nurse came back into the room to check on her and the baby, Monique's thoughts returned to the earlier moments, when she had been left alone, when she had been neglected, when she had been made to feel like she didn't matter. Her fists clenched in frustration, but she held her tongue. It was over now. She had her baby, and that was all that mattered. But as the nurse began to perform the usual post-delivery checks, Monique noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The nurse, Kelly, was acting differently. Her movements were slower, more careful. She seemed to be avoiding eye contact with Monique, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy. Monique's brow furrowed, but she said nothing. She watched as Kelly moved around the room, her back turned to Monique for a moment. Then, without warning, Kelly glanced over her shoulder at James, her eyes widening slightly. James stood still, his expression unreadable. Then, just as quickly as it came, the brief moment of tension was gone. Kelly turned back to Monique, her demeanor changing in an instant. "So, everything seems to be going well," she said, her voice noticeably softer than before. "Your baby's doing great, and so are you. Just let us know if you need anything." Monique felt a strange sense of unease wash over her. It wasn't like Kelly to act so subdued. There had been something in the way she had looked at James that bothered her. James had noticed it too. He watched Kelly closely, his sharp eyes catching the subtle shift in her behavior. He took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Is there a problem, Nurse Kelly?" Kelly hesitated, then quickly shook her head, her smile almost forced. "No problem at all, Dr. Mitchell. Everything's fine." James' gaze didn't falter. "Are you sure?" The nurse's smile wavered. "Yes, of course." James turned to Monique, his eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. He could feel the tension in the room, the discomfort that was slowly building. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew something wasn't right. After a moment, Kelly excused herself, retreating out of the room without another word. Monique turned to James, her curiosity piqued. "What was that about?" James gave her a look, a silent promise in his eyes. "I'll handle it. You've been through enough today." But Monique wasn't so sure. She could feel the storm brewing inside her, the sense of injustice rising again. She had been mistreated, disrespected, and dismissed, and the fact that it had been so easily overlooked by the staff made her blood boil. As the hours passed, Monique couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shift in the staff's attitude was palpable, but it wasn't just because of James's presence. It was something more. The truth, she realized, was beginning to unravel. And with that realization came the flood of emotions she had been holding back. The anger, the hurt, the exhaustion, all of it seemed to hit her at once. But through it all, one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Monique looked at James, her gaze steady. "I want to know what's going on. I need to know why they treated me the way they did." James nodded, his expression grim. "I'll make sure you get the answers you deserve." As he left the room to speak with the hospital administration, Monique found herself alone with her thoughts. The tears she had been holding back began to fall, not from pain or fear, but from a deep, simmering frustration. She had come to this hospital for care, for support, and instead, she had been treated like an afterthought. But she was stronger than that. She had always been stronger than anyone gave her credit for. And no matter what, she was going to make sure her voice was heard. The hours after James left the room felt like an eternity. Monique couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened, the treatment she'd endured, the silent looks exchanged behind her back. The overwhelming feeling of being ignored, disrespected, and belittled kept running through her mind, like a broken record. Her baby, sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside her, was the only thing that kept her grounded. Monique looked down at the tiny face, so innocent, so perfect, and she made a silent promise to herself. She would not let this moment pass without standing up for what was right, for her daughter, and for every woman who had ever been made to feel small in a place where they should have felt safe. As the minutes turned into hours, the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her chest. The hospital had been busy, but the feeling of isolation was still thick. She was surrounded by people, but they had all made it clear they didn't care. It was a cold realization to face, one that she wasn't sure how to process. When James finally returned, he looked tense. His jaw was tight, his brow furrowed. Monique could see that something had shifted. Something serious had happened in his conversation with the hospital staff. He wasn't saying anything, but the lines on his face told a story of their own. He sat down next to her, his hand finding hers. He squeezed it gently, trying to reassure her, but Monique wasn't sure it worked this time. "What happened?" she asked, her voice quiet, yet determined. James took a deep breath before speaking. "I spoke with the administration. They're addressing the situation, but it's more complicated than I thought." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "Monique, I don't want to upset you, but Nurse Kelly, she's been reprimanded. There's an investigation underway." Monique's heart skipped a beat. Part of her wanted to feel relief. After all, someone was finally taking it seriously. But the other part of her wanted to scream, to demand justice for everything she had suffered. She had been made to feel so small, and no one had even batted an eye. "What does that mean exactly?" Monique's voice was barely a whisper. The lump in her throat made it hard to speak. "It means there are going to be consequences," James said, his voice soft but firm. "But it also means there's going to be an internal review. They want to see if there's a pattern of behavior like this happening across the hospital." Monique frowned, not quite sure what that meant. Was it just Nurse Kelly's behavior that had to be investigated, or was it something deeper? "They're going to do everything they can to fix this, I promise you," James added, his gaze intense. But Monique could see the conflict in his eyes. She knew he was torn between his loyalty to the hospital and his love for her. "I'm not asking for them to fix it, James," Monique said, her voice steady now. "I'm asking for justice. I'm asking for accountability. For everything they put me through." James didn't answer right away. He simply held her hand, looking into her eyes. He understood now. He understood the weight of what had happened. He couldn't fix it all in an instant, but he was going to do everything he could to make sure Monique's voice was heard. Monique sat up a little, pushing herself higher against the pillows. Her body still ached, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. She had a mission now. She wasn't going to stay silent, not when her dignity had been trampled on so easily. "I want to meet with the hospital director," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. James looked at her, surprised. "Monique, you don't have to do that. We've already spoken to them." "I need to do this, James," she interrupted, shaking her head. "I need to stand up for myself, and for anyone else who has ever been treated this way." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had seen Monique go through so much, yet it was in this moment, when she was in the most vulnerable position of her life, that he saw the strength of her spirit shine through. She wasn't backing down. "Okay," he said softly, finally nodding. "I'll make the arrangements, but you don't have to face this alone. I'm with you every step of the way." Monique smiled, feeling a sense of relief flood through her. As much as she knew this was going to be difficult, she also knew that it was the right thing to do. She wasn't going to let anyone silence her, no matter what it took. The nurse came back into the room just then, this time with a more sincere smile. Monique couldn't help but notice the difference in her demeanor. But she wasn't fooled. She had already made up her mind. This nurse, like many others, had a lot to answer for. Monique didn't speak, but her eyes locked onto the nurse's for just a moment, making sure her intent was clear. She wasn't going to let it slide. Not anymore. As the nurse checked on the baby, Monique turned to James, who was standing quietly beside her. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice filled with determination. "But it's going to take more than just apologies. It's time to change things." James nodded. "You're right, and I'll make sure we do." Monique looked down at her daughter, a new sense of purpose filling her heart. She was ready to fight for what was right, ready to speak up, even when it felt like the world was pushing her down. Because her story wasn't just her own anymore. It was for every woman who had ever been dismissed, disregarded, or hurt. And now, she was going to make sure that voice was heard. The next day, Monique sat in the small meeting room of the hospital, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The sterile white walls around her seemed to close in, but she held her ground. James sat beside her, his presence a silent reassurance. She had asked for this meeting with the hospital director, and here they were, ready to face the people who had let her down. The director, a tall man in his early 50s, entered the room with a carefully neutral expression. He extended his hand to Monique, though there was no warmth behind the gesture. Monique hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand, her grip firm but not overly enthusiastic. She had learned the hard way that a handshake could mean nothing. She wanted to see what he would do next. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harris," the director said. "I understand that you've had a difficult experience here at our hospital, and I want to assure you that we are taking this matter very seriously." Monique looked him in the eye. "I'm not here for reassurances. I'm here for accountability." James, sitting beside her, shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. He had learned quickly that Monique didn't need anyone to speak for her. She could handle herself. She always had. The director nodded. "I understand, and that's why we're here. To discuss what happened and how we can make it right." Monique held her ground. "I don't need your apologies. What I need is for you to understand what happened and how it was allowed to happen." The director paused for a moment, his lips tight, then sat down at the opposite end of the table. He looked over at James for a second, perhaps unsure what to say, but then turned his attention back to Monique. "Mrs. Harris," he began slowly, "we've conducted an internal investigation. Nurse Kelly has been reprimanded for her actions, and we've put measures in place to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. I want to assure you that we do not tolerate mistreatment of any kind here." Monique's gaze hardened. "Reprimanded? That's all. She left me to suffer for hours. And you think a reprimand will fix that? What about the rest of the staff who watched and did nothing?" The director shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught off guard by Monique's intensity. "We're addressing the behavior of all the staff involved, Mrs. Harris. It's important to understand that there are many layers to a situation like this. We have policies in place for how we handle patients, but we also have to work within the system." Monique could feel the frustration building within her. "What system are you talking about? The one that treats people differently based on their skin color? The one that allows people to be ignored, mistreated, and dismissed?" Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The director shifted in his seat again, this time visibly uncomfortable. James reached out and placed a hand on her arm, But Monique didn't flinch. She wasn't done. "It's not enough," she continued. "This isn't just about one nurse or a handful of staff members. It's about a culture that lets this happen. It's about an environment where people like me have to beg for help while others are given everything they need without question." James was silent, watching Monique closely. He knew her well enough to see that this was more than just about the hospital. It was about everything she had ever fought against. The systemic injustices that had followed her all her life, that had followed so many people like her. The director, realizing that Monique wasn't going to back down, finally spoke again. "We are committed to making changes, Mrs. Harris. This is something we take seriously. But change is a process, and it takes time. We're working on creating better training for our staff, more sensitivity around issues of race and culture. We want to ensure that no patient ever feels what you felt here." Monique wasn't convinced. "And how long will that take? How many people will be hurt in the meantime? How many others will suffer the way I did before you decide to make real change?" She stood up suddenly, her voice rising with passion. "You don't get to tell me that things will be better someday. I'm living in the here and now. And right now, what you did to me was wrong. What you allowed to happen was wrong." There was a long silence in the room. Monique could feel the weight of her words pressing down on the director, pushing him into a corner. He had no easy answers, no quick fixes. James stood up as well, his hand gently resting on Monique's shoulder. "We're not here to have a conversation about when things will get better," he said, his voice firm. "We're here to make sure this doesn't happen again, to ensure that Monique's experience isn't swept under the rug. She deserves to be heard, and this hospital needs to do more than just apologize." The director opened his mouth as if to respond, but there was nothing left to say. He knew that they were right. But how do you fix something as ingrained as the culture of a hospital? How do you erase years of silent complicity? Monique looked at him one last time. "I want to be sure that change actually happens," she said. "And I want you to know that I will be watching. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." As she and James left the meeting room, Monique felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief because she had finally spoken up, but anger because the battle was far from over. There would be more work to do, more people to reach, more systems to challenge. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was no longer alone in this fight. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or hurt. And she wasn't going to stop until things changed. The following weeks passed by in a blur. Monique and James kept pushing forward, working not only with the hospital but with local organizations and advocacy groups to hold the healthcare system accountable. But the real change, Monique realized, had to come from within. It wasn't just about making sure that specific hospital was better. It was about ensuring that the message spread far beyond its walls. James had been by her side through every step of the process, always offering his support. Yet, as they worked together, Monique noticed something different about him, something more vulnerable. James wasn't just her husband now. He was her partner in this fight for justice, and their bond had grown stronger than ever before. He had witnessed the struggles, the pain, and the courage in her, and he admired her more than he ever thought possible. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, a stack of papers and hospital reports spread out before them, Monique sighed and looked at him. "I never imagined we'd be here, James. I thought I could handle everything on my own, but it's different now. I don't want to just fight for me anymore. I want to make sure that no one ever goes through what I did." James put down his pen and turned his attention fully to her. "You're already doing that, Monique. You've already made a difference. And you've got a whole team of people who support you now. Together, We can keep pushing for the changes that matter." Monique smiled faintly. It was a small smile, but it carried weight. "I know, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface. I know there's more to do." Just then, her phone buzzed on the table. Monique glanced at it and saw that it was a message from her sister, Alicia. "Monique, I just wanted to say I'm so proud of you. You're doing something no one else has the guts to do, and I admire your strength. Keep fighting the good fight. The world needs more people like you." Monique's heart swelled as she read the message. Her sister's words hit home. Monique wasn't just fighting against the system. She was fighting for a better world. A world where people like her didn't have to beg for help, where people were treated equally no matter their skin color or background. Later that week, Monique received a phone call from a reporter with a major news outlet. The reporter had heard about her story and wanted to do a feature about her experience, the mistreatment she had suffered, and the work she was doing to create change. It was an opportunity she couldn't turn down. As Monique spoke with the reporter, she realized something profound. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure that other Black women, other mothers, and other patients like her weren't overlooked. She had been given a platform, and now it was time to use it. The day the article came out, Monique's phone was flooded with messages from people who had heard her story. Some were friends, others strangers, but all shared one thing in common. They had been moved by her courage. One particular message stood out to her. It was from a young woman named Kendra, who had read the article online. "Monique, your story gave me hope. I've been going through something similar in my own hospital, and I didn't know how to speak up. But now I feel like I can. Thank you for showing me that I don't have to stand by silently. You're an inspiration." Monique felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was what it was all about. One person at a time, she was making a difference. She had been through the fire, and now she was helping others rise from the ashes with her. James noticed a change in her that day. Monique was no longer just a woman fighting for justice. She was a beacon of hope for others. She had reclaimed her strength, and in doing so, she had become a force to be reckoned with. As the days passed, Monique continued to push for the systemic changes she knew were necessary. She met with lawmakers, spoke at community events, and worked with healthcare reform groups to ensure that the voices of people like her would be heard. Slowly, but surely, the tides were beginning to turn, and it was only the beginning. But it wasn't just about fighting for others. Monique knew that she also needed to find time for herself, to heal, to rest, and to enjoy the life she had built with James and their family. Their daughter, Brianna, was thriving, and the love they shared only grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as the sun set outside their home, Monique stood at the window, looking out at the world beyond. She had come so far, but she knew there was still much more work to be done. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Monique was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. She had fought for herself, and in doing so, she had found a purpose greater than herself. James walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You did it, Monique," he said softly. "You've made a difference." She leaned into him, the weight of everything they had been through finally sinking in. "We did it, James. Together, we did it." And as they stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Monique knew that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but it was hers, and she was ready for whatever came next.